Hello, my dear students. Good morning, all of you. So far, we have discussed different topics in the neuroanatomy. One, we have seen the basal ganglia. Then, we have seen the white matter as well. Today, we are going to discuss about diencephalon. So, the diencephalon means it is also called as interbrain. It is consisting of complex masses of gray matter around the cavity of third ventricle. Let me show you this. Yeah, here we are seeing a slit like a third ventricle. So inside the cerebral hemispheres, you can identify the lateral ventricles, and the lateral ventricles they opens into the third ventricle, which is present medially through a foramen called as interventricular foramen of Monro. So the slit-like third ventricle divides the diencephalon into two symmetrical halves. Then a hypothalamic sulcus. So you can identify a small sulcus over here. So in this medial surface of cerebral hemisphere, what we can identify, the main structure is corpus callosum. Just below the corpus callosum, we can identify this is the head of the caudate nucleus, and here you can see the fornix, and here you can see the thalamus. Just below the fornix, you can identify the thalamus. So on this thalamus, you can identify, just below the fornix, you can identify a sulcus called as hypothalamic sulcus. Let me show you the hypothalamic sulcus. So this hypothalamic sulcus is extending from interventricular foramen anteriorly to the rostral end of the aqueduct of midbrain. Here you can see the aqueduct. So from the interventricular foramen, and it is extending posteriorly and reaching to the rostral to the aqueduct. And this hypothalamic sulcus, which is separating into two parts, separating the diencephalon, each half of the diencephalon into two halves. One is ventral part, and behind that is the dorsal part. Okay, so this hypothalamic sulcus is dividing the diencephalon into two parts, ventral part and the dorsal part. So what are the structures we can identify in the ventral part? What are the structures we can identify in the dorsal part? Let us see that. So the ventral part is called as pars ventralis. This part is called as pars ventralis. Behind the hypothalamic sulcus, that area is called as pars dorsalis. So in the pars dorsalis, you can identify the thalamus. Then we can see the metathalamus. Then metathalamus, it is including lateral and the medial geniculate bodies. Epithalamus, which is consisting of the pineal body. Oh, so these are the structures I will show you. And let me show you here. You can see the hypothalamic sulcus in this picture. Now, here you can see the pars ventralis and the pars dorsalis. Now, in the pars dorsalis, you can identify one is a pineal body. So we can see the pineal body over here. Now I am showing you in this picture the pineal body. Then next we are going to identify the habenular nucleus over here. So there's a pineal body. Above the pineal body, we can identify habenular nucleus, and then the commissure along with that, habenular commissure. Then here you can see the posterior commissure as well. Then here you can see the striae medullaris. Then coming to the pars ventralis, what we can identify the pars ventralis are. So it is present ventral to the hypothalamic sulcus and consisting of subthalamus and the hypothalamus. Okay. So here you can see the subthalamus, and here now we are going to see the thalamus. So where you can see the thalamus is, we can identify thalamus in the pars dorsalis. So thalamus is a large ovoid mass. So when you are writing in the examination point of view, try to draw easy diagrams and represent easily so that the valuer can understand easily and you will get easily the good marks. So let us explore the thalamus. So anatomically, the thalamus is a large ovoid mass. It is a mass of gray matter lying above the midbrain, from which it is separated by a small amount of neuronal tissue called as subthalamus. There are two thalami situated on either side of third ventricle. Here you can see the third ventricle. So on either side of the third ventricle, we can identify the large ovoid gray matter. It is called as the thalamus. So that is about the thalamus, and the long axis of thalami are set obliquely running backwards and laterally. So here you can see the schematic diagram representation of the thalamus, how it is present. So it is running backwards and laterally. The pointed anterior ends near to the median plane. So here you can see the pointed anterior end, you can identify here. So they are projecting towards medially, whereas the wider posterior ends, they are separated from each other by a pineal body. Here you can see the pineal body, then superior colliculus, then after that habenular triangles. This triangular area, we can identify it as habenular triangles. So the anterior ends, they are present near to each other. Posterior ends are away from each other. So between the posterior ends of the thalamus, we can identify these structures. One is superior colliculus, habenular nucleus, triangle, and medial to this one, we can identify the pineal body. Okay. So functionally, the thalamus is generally considered as the great sensory gateway to the cerebral cortex. So it receives the impulses from the opposite half of the body and transmits most of them to the sensory area of the cerebral cortex. That is area number 3, 1, 2, which are present in post-central gyrus. So let us explore these ends, borders, surfaces, all these things we'll see now. So coming to the anterior end, here you can see the anterior end, and this is the posterior end. Now we are going to see one by one what is anterior end, what are the structures present at anterior end. These are all the things we are going to see now. Now coming to the anterior end, it is also called as anterior end is narrow, and it is directing forwards and medially and forms posterior boundary of interventricular foramina. Here you can see the anterior end, which is present behind the interventricular foramina. And coming to the posterior end, you can see the posterior end. So the posterior end, it is also called as, it is known as the pulvinar. Remember the term, posterior end of the thalamus is called as pulvinar. It is broad and projects backwards and laterally, as I have shown you in the picture. So here you can see the posterior ends, they are called as pulvinar. They are away from each other, then they are projecting backwards and laterally. So they are beyond the third ventricle. It overlaps the superior colliculus of the midbrain and presents lateral geniculate body inferolaterally and medial geniculate body inferomedially. I will show you this medial lateral geniculate body in a few minutes. Then the lateral is separated by the pulvinar by the brachium of superior colliculus. So let me show you that superior colliculus and its brachium. Yeah, here you can see the superior colliculus. That the section what we are seeing here is we have took a transverse section. Two different sections we have done, and we are seeing the cerebrum and the middle part, midbrain, pons, and cerebellum from the superior view, so that we can identify the superior colliculus over here and its brachium, which is present just lateral to the brachium, which is connected to the thalamus, which exactly, strictly speaking, posterior ends of the thalamus. Then moving to the surfaces, two ends, remember, anterior and the posterior end. Now moving to the surfaces, there are four surfaces of that. One is upper surface. Upper surface of thalamus is somewhat convex and covered by a thin sheet of white matter. We can identify here is covered by thin sheet of white matter. It is called as stratum zonale. Along the dorsolateral margin, the surface is accompanied by striate terminalis. Let me show you all the structures over here. Yeah, here you can see that. Here is a superior surface of or upper surface of thalamus. Here you can identify striae terminalis. So striae terminalis is nothing but the band of nerve fibers which are running over the superior surface of the thalamus. That is called as striae terminalis. And here you can identify the thalamostriate vein. Thalamostriate vein. So thalamostriate vein and the striae terminalis both are lodged. Both are lodged in the groove between thalamus and the caudate nucleus. So here you can see this is nothing but the thalamus, and here you can see the caudate nucleus. Between the thalamus and the caudate nucleus, in this area, the striae terminalis and thalamostriate vein which are present. And also we can identify medially the upper surface is separated from the medial surface by thickening of ependymal roof of third ventricle known as tinea thalami. Then dorsomedially, the upper surface is accompanied by a thin nerve fibers called as striae medullaris. So here we can see the striae terminalis over here, and posteriorly we can identify striae medullaris, where exactly posterior dorsomedially. Okay, so superior surface, it is having ventral aspect and the dorsal aspect. In the ventral aspect, we have seen striae terminalis, thalamostriate vein, and we can identify these two structures are present in the groove between thalamus medially and laterally we can identify the caudate nucleus. Whereas posteriorly means dorsally, dorsomedial and dorsolateral. At the dorsomedial, we can identify the striae medullaris, which is present approximately here. Here it is present, striae medullaris. Yeah, in this picture, I can show you the striae medullaris over here. Then, which traced behind forms the anterior boundary of habenular trigone. So this triangular area is called as habenular trigone. Then comes the upper surface is divided into lateral and the medial areas by free margin of the fornix. Now, what is the fornix? Now we have to understand. So here you can see the fornix, a band of fibers which are running, nerve fibers, the white matter fibers which are forming the fornix. As you have seen the corpus callosum, this fornix is also a band of nerve fibers. So this fornix is running over the superior surface of the thalamus, and so this fornix is running over the superior surface of thalamus, and it is separating this superior surface into medial and the lateral areas. So what happened to the lateral area is, lateral area forms the floor of the central part of the lateral area, forming the floor of central part of the lateral ventricle. Let me show you that. Yeah, here you can see that. So lateral part of superior surface is forming the floor of the central part of the lateral ventricle. Okay, superior surface is forming the floor of central part of lateral ventricle. Once again, you just revise the lateral ventricle. Lateral ventricle, it is having anterior horn, posterior horn, inferior horn, whereas it is having a central part as well, C-shaped part. So the central part, it is having roof and floor. So the floor of the central part of the lateral ventricle, which is approximate at the level of the superior surface of the thalamus, strictly speaking, lateral part of the superior surface of thalamus. And here you can identify what are the structures present here are the choroid plexus, which is present at the superior surface of the thalamus. And other structures which we can identify are the medial area of the upper surface is separated by the body of the fornix. Here you can see the body of the fornix. So the medial area is separated by the body of the fornix, and the structure which is present here is tela choroidea of the third ventricle. That is about the superior surface lateral area and the medial area. Then moving to the next surface is, so here you can see the telachoroidea, thalamus striate vein as well. Then coming to the lower surface of the thalamus is related to zona incerta. So here I am just showing you the schematic diagram to remember and to identify easily. The inferior surface of the thalamus is related to this zona incerta, then subthalamic nucleus, and then subthalamic prolongation of midbrain containing rostral end of red nucleus. That I'm not showing you in the picture, but remember, rostral end of the head nucleus, it is also related to the inferior surface of the thalamus. The space between zona incerta and the thalamus. Here we are seeing the thalamus, and this is zona incerta. Between the inferior surface of the thalamus and the zona incerta, we can identify field of H1. It is also called as H1 of 4L. It is occupied by fasciculus thalamicus and dentatorubro-thalamic fibers. Then the interval between zona incerta and the subthalamic nucleus, we can identify field of H2. This is also called a field of H2 of 4L. It is traversed by fasciculus lenticularis. And then between the thalamus, here you can see the thalamus, and here is zona incerta. Just immediately to this one, you can identify field H of 4L. This is called as pre-rubral field. So these structures already have discussed in the basal ganglia. So once again, I will explain you about this under the connections of thalamus and the connections of the basal ganglia. Okay. Then moving to the next surface is the medial surface. So the medial surface forms the major portion of the lateral wall of the third ventricle. So this cavity is nothing but the third ventricle. So the lateral wall of the third ventricle is related to the medial surface of thalamus. So more than 70% subjects, the medial surface of both thalami are bridged across the third ventricle by interthalamic adhesion. Here you can see the interthalamic adhesion or interthalamic connections which contain nerve cells and the nerve fibers. Then coming to the next surface is the lateral surface. So the lateral surface of thalamus is separated. From the lentiform nucleus. This V-shaped part. This is nothing but the lentiform nucleus by the posterior limb of internal capsule. And then coming to the subdivisions of thalamus. Next we are going to see the subdivisions of thalamus. So a vertical sheet of white matter, the internal medullary laminae, divides the thalamus into medial and the lateral nuclear masses. I just want to show you another diagram to tell you clearly. Yes. Here we can see the colorful one, which we can identify all the areas easily. So this Y-shaped band, this is nothing but internal medullary laminae. Okay, so this internal medullary laminae is dividing the thalamus into medial and lateral nuclear masses. Okay, medial and lateral nuclear masses. So I'm just going to explain one by one. You try to draw this diagram on a piece of paper, on a white paper, and try to divide this. Okay, if you use color pencils, it is very, very helpful. Or if you use normal pencil and label it properly, then it is easy to remember. Okay, so let us go through it. So the Y-shaped laminae, internal medullary laminae, is separating the thalamus into medial and lateral nuclear masses. So the intralaminar nuclei lie within intralaminar, this brown color one. So this is called as intralaminar nuclei. Okay, so intralaminar nuclei which is present in the internal medullary lamina. Okay, so then coming to the another thin sheet of white matter, the external medullary lamina covers the lateral surface. Here you can see the external medullary lamina. Okay, so outside of the thalamus, lateral surface to the thalamus, outside of the lateral surface you can identify external medullary lamina. Okay, so internal is present inside, outside is the external medullary lamina. Okay, so this covers the lateral surface of thalamus. Then the reticular nucleus of thalamus forms a thin shell of nerve cells and intervenes between external medullary lamina and the posterior limb of internal capsule. So here I am just showing you this reticular thalamic nucleus, RTN. This reticular thalamic nucleus, which is present between posterior limb of internal capsule and the lateral surface of thalamus, this dark color one. Okay, so that you label it as RTN, means reticulothalamic nucleus. Okay, then coming to the next areas. So the 6 basic groups of nuclear masses with many subgroups are encountered in the thalamus. They are anterior group. Let us see and discuss about all the groups. First one is the anterior group. Anterior group which intervenes between the diverging limbs of internal medullary lamina. Diverging limbs of internal medullary lamina. So it is consisting of 3 areas: anterior ventral, anterior dorsal, and anterior medial. Okay, so anterior ventral, anterior dorsal, and anterior medial. 3 areas you can remember easily. Green color one is anterior ventral, and then posterior one is anterior dorsal, and middle one is anterior medial. Okay, then coming to the medial or dorsomedial group. Dorsomedial group, it intervenes between the internal medullary laminae and the midline nucleus. So the midline nucleus, which is present at the medial surface of the thalamus, between the internal medullary laminae and the midline nucleus, you can identify the dorsomedial group. So this dorsomedial group, it is having 2 parts. So the anterior part is called as magnocellular part, and posterior part is called as parvocellular part. Magnocellular and the parvocellular part. Okay. Then coming to the lateral group. So medial group I have discussed. Then we are going to discuss about entire this lateral group. Okay. So the lateral group, it is consisting of a largest group of nuclear masses, which are arranged in a ventral and the dorsal tiers. Okay. So let us discuss about the ventral one. So it is consisting of 2 cytological subdivisions. One is parvocellular part and the magnocellular part. Okay, so one is, here you can see that ventral anterior. This part, this brown color one is parvocellular part, and here you can see this one is magnocellular part. Okay, then coming to the ventral lateral group, it is consisting of 3 areas. From anterior to posterior. We can identify pars oralis. Then behind that is pars caudalis. Then pars medullaris. Pars oralis, pars caudalis, and pars medullaris. Okay. Then coming to the ventral posterior group. This is the ventral posterior group. So this ventral posterior group is subdivided into posterolateral and the posteromedial groups. So intervenes between the ventral to the junction of ventral posterolateral and the ventral posteromedial. Okay, so remember, just lateral posterior one is ventral posterolateral, ventral posteromedial. Okay, these are vertically divided. These are horizontally divided. Okay. Then coming to the most posterior, we can identify 2 different structures called as medial geniculate body and the lateral geniculate body. So the geniculate bodies form together form the metathalamus. So medial and the lateral geniculate bodies, they forms the metathalamus. And the dorsal tire is consisting of ventral and the dorsal parts. Yes, last one we are going to discuss about the 2 nucleus. One is lateral dorsal nuclei and lateral posterior nuclei. Okay, so here you can see the lateral dorsal nuclei and lateral posterior nuclei. Okay, these are the lateral dorsal and lateral posterior. Then other nuclei which we can identify is intralaminar nucleus. Here you can see the intralaminar nuclei. These are, one is centromedian nucleus. This forms the prominent nucleus in the middle third of the thalamus. This is called as centromedian nucleus. And then parafascicular nucleus, it lies medial to the centromedian nucleus. Okay, parafascicular nucleus. Let me find the parafascicular nucleus. So that is about two intralaminar nucleus. Then other nucleus or midline nuclei, which are two groups, anterior and the posterior groups. So these groups are dorsomedial nucleus and the ependymal. So these two nucleus, midline nucleus, they are present lateral wall of the third ventricle. So they are present at the lateral wall of third ventricle. Okay, so anterior 3, then lateral is the biggest complex compartment. So in the lateral we have seen 1, 2, 2 in the ventral anterior, 3 in the ventral lateral, 2 in the ventral posterior. Okay, and then here you can see 2 in the dorsal compartment, lateral dorsal, this one is blue one, lateral dorsal, and behind it is the lateral posterior. Okay, and medial to this one is the two other compartments, they are midline nucleus. Okay, these are midline nucleus, and our last one is reticular thalamic nucleus. Reticular thalamic nucleus, as already I have explained you, which is present between the posterior limb of internal capsule and the lateral surface of the thalamus. So this is the external feature, these are the external features of thalamus. So in the next class we are going to discuss about the connections of thalamus, and also we are going to discuss about the connections of the basal ganglia. Thank you, dear students. See you.